Hello friends, my name is Mandanna, and today we're going to be talking about the 8 books that I read last month. I want to start off by talking about 3 books that I thought a lot about in comparison to each other. I didn't pick these books on purpose because they were comparable at all. I just ended up reading them all in the same month, and I have thoughts about how they went about the kind of story that they were telling and which one I felt was more successful. So they are The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, and Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. We'll start with The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, which was the House Salt pick for the month of November. We just had the live show a couple of days ago, so that is live. This is a reimagining of the classic story of the island of Dr. Moreau, and true to Moreno-Garcia's style, it is a story that meshes a lot of different genres. It has that feeling of historical fiction, which goes along with a lot of Moreno-Garcia's work, but it is also science fiction. And while I thought it would be a little bit more horror, it has a little taste of that at the beginning of the book, but it didn't actually feel very horror-ish to me. Moreno-Garcia is one of my favorite authors. I did just talk about her work recently. In my last video, I was talking about The Beautiful Ones, which I loved, and is probably one of my favorite Moreno-Garcias. And so now we have The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, which is probably now one of my least favorite Moreno-Garcias. And I say that having given it like a 3 out of 5 stars. I will talk about the thing that dragged down the rating for me, but before I do, I want to talk about the good here. And the good here is that Moreno-Garcia's work always makes me think. I think that she is doing something really interesting and specific in her work, in which she is taking like well-known stories or genres or tropes, and she is infusing a freshness into them by placing them firmly in her own experiences as a Mexican woman in historical settings with like dashes of fantasy, which really inform other elements of her story, and this felt along those lines. While I don't know that this was exactly saying anything about eugenics and like the racism that it brought up and talking about the rebellion that it was sort of mired in as well, I think that it means something to add those elements into a classic story and to twist a bit of like the science fiction in terms of experimentation on humans by adding these elements of eugenics and colonialism and racism. And I just find her work to be so thought-provoking and so interesting. The other thing that I love about her work is that her writing is really evocative. I find her work really descriptive. It took me a while to kind of put together, and it wasn't talking through it in the live show that I realized. I was like, I wonder how this book is descriptive. And almost immediately, I thought about how I could picture the island. I could picture the house. There was a sense of place here pretty strongly, and then Paige echoed that in saying that she felt like the best description here was in sense of place, which makes sense for a story that really is about being trapped and kind of this mad scientist or whatnot who created his own world, who is playing God, so to speak. So that sense of place is really important to the story, and it absolutely shone through for me. Next, we have The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. I read this for another book club. It was the Hope Punk book club that Taylor is leading, and really the project of the book club is to read Hope Punk books with like an eye towards thinking about what it's telling us about the future and what messaging about the future, or what hope or what view of the future we walk away from with these books. That live show also happened yesterday, so that is up for you guys to see and watch us talk through these ideas. Basically, this book follows this idea that cities can be born after they've like reached a certain age. They can be birthed into like human avatars that then represent the city, and the city of New York is in the process of being born. It is being challenged by some force of evil that doesn't want to let this happen, and so the process of New York being born into this avatar is sort of interrupted in the middle, and New York's avatar is in crisis. But because it's New York, the 5 boroughs also have avatars, and as they realize who they are and what they're meant to do, they start not only fighting against this force of evil, trying to protect their borough, but also trying to come together to find the main avatar and figure out how to ultimately defeat the force of evil. This was one that was really tricky for me because there were a few things like right up at the front that weren't for me. Part of what this is doing is like writing a love letter to the city of New York. It is not romanticizing the city. It is very clear-eyed about like the good and bad things about the city, and it is exploring just like larger themes about living in the cities and how in sharing spaces, like the good and bad that comes from people sharing spaces and how we treat each other and how we interact. So there are larger just like city themes here, but I don't like the city of New York. I have family there. I've been there a lot of times. I've spent plenty of time in New York, and I just do not enjoy that city at all. So reading this whole book that is like not only like this love letter to the city, but requires you to have a certain knowledge of the city. It felt a little bit like sometimes there were like in-jokes about like living there that I'm not going to catch on to, I'm not going to enjoy. And so I was constantly just working against that a little bit in this story. But again, I think that what Jemisin is saying is really interesting here. I appreciated the project of this as well. We had like a whole hour's worth of just like picking apart the elements of this book. And so that really speaks to how layered it was, how thoughtful it was, and sort of what it was presenting. And I do like sort of the whole conceit, right? Like this idea of the city being born and being represented in this diverse cast of characters, and this idea of like coming together despite differences to like fight evil, and the way that it took on different topics about racism also, and just like disagreeing with those around you and like opposing politics and all of that, I thought was pretty interesting and pretty well done. And third, for the Nearby Realms book club that I host in partnership with Chirp Books, I picked Pet by Akwaeke Emezi for the month of November. This was my first Emezi book, and this is young adult fiction about like a utopian sort of future where all of the monsters have been weeded out of society, so there isn't any more like big crime essentially, or that is what everybody has been led to believe. We follow a character and her mother and her father, and basically her mother paints this picture, and Jam accidentally gets a drop of blood on it, and it calls forth the monster that her mother created. And this monster says that he's here to hunt down a real monster in the city. The main character, Jam, has a hard time believing that this is true. She believes that there are no monsters left, and that becomes even more challenging for her to accept when she realizes who the paint monster, the picture monster, is here to actually hunt down. I thought that this was so well done, and I kind of want to pause in my review of this book here to tie these three books together, because all of them feel a little bit like fables to me. All of them felt like they were being led sort of with the thing, the project that it's doing, what it wanted to say. I could even actually put Babel in here as well, as a sort of story that is being led by its messaging, by its themes, by its thematic content, and does feel sort of metaphorical or like a fable in that way. But my problem with Babel, the daughter of Dr. Moreau, and The City We Became, is that while intellectually I could like sit back and appreciate the project of it all, and I could think like a ton about what it was ultimately saying, all of those books felt like they were missing a storytelling element to me. Like it was being so led by the project and the message that it like dropped the ball on some basic storytelling aspects. And for all three, I would say that part of it is the characterization, right? That we were being led through the story by characters that felt like archetypes or stereotypes, or like characters that were more in service of the message or the plot than like fully formed characters in and of themselves. It was difficult to read those three at points in terms of pacing. Like I felt dips in pacing in those three because there wasn't really an investment in the story. But I felt like Pet was trying to tell the same type of story, but did it more successfully, especially because I felt more of an investment in the characters and the actual plot that was happening than I did with these other three books. And it's interesting to me because Pet is told with a lot more economy. I wouldn't even say that it's an intricate sort of look at any one character because it is short. It happens pretty quickly, and we don't spend a ton of time digging deep into any one person's character, but I felt immediately involved. I felt immediately like bought into the stakes. I felt immediately like my feelings and my heart went out to the family dynamic, to the dynamic between the communities. I felt like I was scared for the main character. I was rooting for her. It felt like she was a fully formed character. The way that in 200 pages, all of that was put together in a way that these other books didn't manage in many, many more pages, I thought was really impressive. And the reason that I'm comparing them is because I felt like I kept having that complaint of like, well, this is a story led by a message, but it's missing out on its characters. And it happened back to back to back. And then I read Pet and it was like, ugh, this is a story led by a message, very metaphorical, but it hooked me with its characters as well. Oftentimes in utopian type stories, what we're really discovering is that the society is not as good as we originally imagined. And that is sort of the case here. But what I really appreciated about sort of the story and the messaging was this idea that even if you've achieved sort of like a good thing, you know, this utopian sort of setting, that you really can't stop fighting, or that you can't be unawares. You can't be caught unawares, that you always have to be vigilant is kind of the thing here. And that's what the city of Lucille had to kind of reckon with, that they had let the monster back into their society simply because they refused to believe that it could happen. And they refused to believe that people who had done good could do bad ever again. And they refused to kind of learn the lesson of the past or whatnot. And I thought that that was really interesting and a neat take on sort of a utopian society. Ultimately, I gave The Daughter of Dr. Moreau 3 stars, The City We Became 3 stars, and Pet 5 stars. Okay, I'm going to group up these next 2 books as well, because a few weeks ago I read Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher, and it put me in such a mood for that sort of like cozy-ish fantasy. It's weird to say about Nettle and Bone because while it is very cozy and it has those fairy tale vibes, it takes on really dark subject matters, and I really loved that combination of things. I love fairy tales or fairy tale-esque feeling things that don't look away from the dark side of fairy tales, and that book really managed to capture that while at the same time having the coziness of like this found family dynamic and a quest fantasy that left the taste in my mouth of like wanting more like that. So I just started looking around for cozy fantasies, and I picked up The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandanna. This is an adult fantasy romance, and in this world, witches are kind of in hiding. They don't even meet together in the same place very often because it is very dangerous for them to be together, and they are worried about being discovered by society and what it could mean if people find out that they are witches. We follow our main character, Micah, who is a witch, and she feels very isolated and alone, especially in not being able to sort of be true to who she is and practice her magic. So she decides to start like a YouTube channel essentially where she is, it's like a witchy YouTube channel, but to her it's like playing at something that is obviously fake, but in a way that she still gets to express that side of herself. But lo and behold, somebody comes across it that actually needs a real witch because they have the care of 3 young girls, 3 young wards who are also witches who need help understanding their magic and getting it under control. This was indeed very cozy. I gobbled it up in like one sitting. I also really appreciated the found family dynamics here. There is a bit of a grumpy character who doesn't want her there and is very protective over the children, and I appreciated that dynamic as well. Even when he was being a grump towards her, like the story took care to like get us to understand his point of view and watch him sort of change and recognize his behavior. So it was a good grumpy sunshine dynamic. Most of it was a very obvious like progression of the plot, like I knew what was coming, except for one twist where I was like, I'm sorry, run that by me again. So that was fun. That there was one moment in the book that I was like, I guessed everything else that was coming except for that. It was interesting because when I picked this up finally, I got it from the library. I had a hold on it. I was like, oh, it's like out of fall. So like, the witchy vibes, the fall vibes, but it actually has a really good wintry vibe. If you are looking for romances or books with like wintry vibes, this would be a good one. I had a good time, but I was struggling deciding what the star rating would be because this wasn't anything like super groundbreaking, but I enjoyed it while I was reading it. And I had settled somewhere in that like 3.5 sort of range, but I read this a few weeks ago and it was really, really hard for me to sort of like remember details, character names. All I really had was like a vague sense of the vibes. And it took like me looking it up to be like, oh yes. And I'm somebody who can use staying power as a good indication of how well a book worked for me. Things that I really, really love stay with me pretty well. I have a pretty good memory for like the feelings and the details of the books that I think were well done or that really hit home with me. So the fact that it's only been, less than a month, I read this, this is my monthly wrap up, and I'm like, well, what was that again? Kind of directs me towards that 3-star range, But that's not to say that I wouldn't recommend this. I would. It was fun. It was cute. It's got good vibes, good found family. It's got that cozy fantasy vibe. If you're also in the mood for that ever, I think that this is a pretty solid choice. After I read that one, I was like, okay, I still want cozy fantasy. Let me go back to Kingfisher. So I picked up A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, and this one was also very cute. It is a young adult fantasy about a girl who her magic is basically like baking magic. She can speak to dough and like impress her will on dough basically. But she is like cold to arms when she realizes that there is a plot in the city to basically kill all magic users. Somebody is hunting them down, and she discovers a dead body in her bakery, and then the police are after her because of her involvement of discovering the body. So she is quickly wrapped up in all of this like war and politics in her city, but all she has is like baking magic. I thought that this was super, super cute. I did have a bit of a hard time because I listened to this on audiobook and I kept forgetting that the main character was young because the voice of the narrator was obviously an adult. And so I had to keep reminding myself that the main character was 14 because I would like forget. I'd be like thinking of her as an adult and something would happen where I'd be like, girl. And I'm like, no, wait, she's 14. Remember, she is a child, like being put at the front of all of this war and politics. This was really funny, and it did have those cozy vibes, sort of, because it had like the baking and the bakery and the baking magic, and that's kind of all what the main character wanted for herself. But the scale of this was actually much larger and much more important than like what you would imagine if you're thinking cozy fantasy. I would say like there was a ton of humor, there was a found family sort of aspect as well, but there was like war and like an attempted sort of like genocide of magic users and things that felt a little more hefty. I think that this kind of struggled with scale because of that. Like I struggled sort of putting into perspective like the size of the city and like the scale of the conflict and like the size of the armies. Like I didn't really have a good sense of how big anything was, especially because we kept being tied back to this like young girl and her baking magic, which all seemed like relatively small, but the things that she was being asked to do and the things that she was doing were also very big, which was kind of the point, but still left sort of like a question mark in my head in terms of scale. I think that this also struggled a little bit with pacing. There were moments that like where she was just not as engaged in sort of like the big things. Like there was a time where she was just kind of waiting around and hiding, which fine, you know, the natural ebb and flow of a story, but I felt it as a reader as like a pretty big dip in pacing. Like I kind of wanted to just rush through that and be over with that. I did really like the showdown at the end, the big sort of like set piece of using her magic. So ultimately like the end made up for that middle drag. And this was pretty memorable. Like I'm sitting here remembering all of those set pieces and remembering specific scenes and interactions. So I would give this like a 3.5, maybe a 4 out of 5 stars. I don't know. If you guys haven't noticed, it takes a while for like books to settle in my head and for ratings to really solidify. So that's why I often give like a range. But yes, right now I'm kind of between 3.5 and 4 out of 5 stars, but it will settle somewhere in there. Okay, the last 3 books on this list are not tied together at all. So the first one is for a project, and that is that I am reading all of the final in the romance category for the Goodreads Choice Awards, which I did last year and had a ton of fun doing, so I'm doing it again this year. I'm going to hold off really talking about any of these books until I put together my wrap-up video, but the first one that I read was Things We Never Got Over by Lucy Score, and you know, there will be a wrap-up. There is like a little like quick review of it up on TikTok, and then I will do like more in-depth reviews of each of these and rank them at the end. And then I also read Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. I think I saw Max from Well Done Books talking about this, and then I was scrolling through my library's app on Libby and I saw that this was available and I was like, cool. It was at the point where I was like picking up reading again after I really hadn't read anything while I was traveling, and I was like, oh, Max said that this was good. I love listening to nonfiction read by the author, especially like before bed, and this was a really, really interesting reading experience for me. Lulu Miller is an NPR reporter, and she heard a story about David Starr Jordan sort of in passing and the way that he doggedly pursued his work. And in a time of personal grief and upheaval, she kind of found like inspiration in looking more into this man's life and trying to figure out like what motivated him and what pushed him to keep going in the face of like losing a ton of his work and all of this. And the more that she reads about him, the more she finds out that his history is really fraught, and it includes like eugenics and maybe even possibly murder. And so it's her kind of exploring all of this history of the man, and but also tying it to her own personal feelings as she goes through a difficult time in her life. This was a great blend. I love nonfiction that takes on sort of different airs, and this did. She is obviously a reporter, so there is a portion of this that is sharing information that she has found out, that she has researched about this man, the scientist's life, but also she is tying it to really personal things. She is exploring sort of big ideas about like the meaning of life. So like it was very like heavy and hefty and personal, but also it was giving this interesting information. The thing that kind of threw me is that I didn't know anything about this man, David Starr Jordan. And so when it became clear that he was like a racist and maybe also a murderer, or at least involved in murder, I felt really ill at ease by the way that this story had presented this man to me in the beginning, and the way that I felt like it actually didn't do enough to counter sort of the very admiring look at this man that it was presented at the beginning. And I can see the way that we were brought through this experience the same way that Lulu Miller probably experienced it, of having to discover that this man that she admired actually was probably a pretty terrible person. And while I can appreciate that in theory, I didn't love it the way that it sat in my feelings. Towards the end, when we sat more and more in her sort of very boldly saying like this man was a racist, it started to feel a little bit better, but it did taint the reading experience, especially because I really loved the blend of genres. I really loved the voice here. So I think I'm settling at like a 4 out of 5 stars. It is one that if you enjoy nonfiction, I would say to check out, especially if you're kind of forewarned that David Starr Jordan is a terrible person. I don't feel like I was. Again, I picked it up because I was like, oh, somebody told me about this. So maybe that was my bad. If you like nonfiction, that blends subgenres, if you also like nonfiction audiobooks read by the author, this is definitely one that I would still say to check out. And finally, I read We Deserve Monuments by Jas Hammonds. This was sent to me by the publisher. I did work with them on a campaign over on TikTok, and it was for promotion, but I did end up reading this book and I really, really loved it. This is not a paid promotion at all. That was for TikTok. This is just me genuinely saying that after I read the book, I really liked it. I don't read a ton of YA contemporary. It's not my chosen sort of like category genre mix, but this did such a great job capturing the main character's voice and experience and an atmosphere. So in this book, we follow our main character, Avery, who has to move from DC to a small town in Georgia with her family to help take care of her grandmother who has terminal cancer. The relationship between her mother and her grandmother is really fraught. This is actually only the second time that Avery has ever been to visit her grandmother. So there is a lot of like dealing with the fact that her grandmother is ill, as well as dealing with like a bunch that she doesn't know about her own family history and the complicated relationship between her own mother and her grandmother. This was very, very atmospheric, and I think it really goes down to capturing the tension between all of the relationship and letting that just sort of travel throughout the entire story. There was something very almost, I almost use the word creepy, but that's not the right word. But I don't know how to like explain the way that this just captured the tension and brought it throughout. There was also that feeling of like hazy small town that was captured well as well. I appreciated the voice of the main character in here. I thought it was pretty authentic to her experiences and her age, and I thought it was easy to understand where she was coming from, even when she was being like a teen about something. Like I understood like her problems, I understood her frustration, I understood her motivation, I understood the actions she was taking, which is like what I love to see in YA as somebody who's reading it and I'm not the intended audience. If I can still be so firmly seated in the experience where like I get the main character, I think that that's like how you know, like you're killing the game. But best of all, what I really appreciated here was the thematic content. So this is very much about family trauma. It is about the way that Jim Crow era in the South still sort of like affects contemporary families and the legacy of that and how it's passed on and sort of how it manifests in the relationship between these women in this family. And I thought all of that was just really, really well explored. There is also a sapphic romance at the heart of this. And while our main character is already out, so this isn't like a coming out story, there is an element of coming out involved in this as well. And so I know people aren't always in the market for like a coming out or like a Black trauma sort of story, but I think that this did it with so much care and it was very, very tender. And it also allowed all of these moments of joy and love and relationship building to come forward. And I think it was great because it's paired with a story for our main character that isn't really about self-discovery. It is more about like permission to be who she wants to be. She has a pretty good sense of herself and what she wants, but she's always kind of held that back a little bit. So being a little bit more firmly rooted in a character who is out, who knows who she is, who is just only kind of struggling to give herself permission to fully be that, I thought was a nice balance to some of the other elements in the story as well. If you enjoy young adult contemporaries or young adult romances, I think you would enjoy this one. So I would recommend We Deserve Monuments, which I gave 4 or 4.5 out of 5 stars. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I've mentioned, let's chat down in the comments. I apologize for the sun, but I didn't want to stop. I have to get this filmed and edited and posted because I'm late on day 2, now 3 of my Vlogmas. So, you know, I, messed up early, so there's only up to go from here. It's fine. I was super, super busy with work. I didn't finish until late on a Friday night, and then I had a live show, and I was like, you know what? I'm done. So here you go, just a little bit late. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Moreno-Garcia is one of my favorite authors. I feel like I talked about her recently. Why? So in this book, we follow... Who do we follow? I think that the sun is shining right in my face.